We're at Sunup Ranch in southwest Cass County. The ranch has been here since 1976, and Vickie and I moved back here in 1993 when we built a house on the east side of the ranch. When we first moved back to the ranch, we had all open pastures for the cattle, so the cattle could just go wherever they wanted. It wasn't really a managed grazing. Rotational grazing really improved the pastures and the cattle. The cattle tend to pick the most choice forages first, so they'll go through and pick all the choice feed and then move on to another area and eat all the choice feed there without eating the less desirable forages. So if we keep them confined to one paddock or pasture that's a little smaller, they'll make more use of the forage, and then it also allows that to regrow when they're moved off of that paddock. So we get more grazing and grazing longer into the fall. We've definitely noticed better forage production with the rotational grazing. Just measuring or visually, we get better regrowth because we have more pastures, more paddocks that we can rotate them through. So instead of having them just on one big pasture, we're able to rotate them and then keep them grazing well into the fall. The reason that we changed to a rotational grazing system was we found out about it from NRCS and from some other cattle producers, and so we looked into it further for our own operation and found out that we could get some assistance on the design of the rotational grazing and putting in fencing for rotational grazing and a water system. And then as we saw that it was working better, we started doing more divisions of the pastures.
Prior to starting our work with NRCS, we had all open pastures. We grazed 3 pastures for the mares, and over here, this was just one big pasture that the cows were turned out on at about the same date, but they had the whole thing. So, gosh, we've learned a lot, and we're really happy with what we're seeing on our ground.
This is all natural growth here. We haven't done any seeding in this pasture. So the forages and the weeds that you see here are all a lot of native grasses and regrowth from when it was grazed in June. We've divided this up into a couple more paddocks with the temporary step-in posts. So just this one wire keeps the cattle out of there. The smaller one up towards the road, they were in there for 4 days. And then this section right here, they're in for 4 days, I think. And now they're in a larger pasture, so they've been in there for about 12 days.
Oh, yeah.
It's not as divided up as this one because there's a lot of trees.
The one they're in now is more of a wooded pasture.
Yeah. This is a pasture that we grazed in June. So now we've kept the cattle out of here. And they're in a different pasture, so we're getting a lot of regrowth here. So we're bringing the cows from this pasture where they've been for about 12 days and bringing them into this pasture that was grazed back in end of May and early June. So they'll be coming on new grass through these gates right here. We like to get them all together before we move them through the gate, especially when the cows have calves by their side, so that we know that all the calves get through. So we had 4 horses and 4 riders out there to get the cattle all in a group because they were a little spread out, and then we brought them through to the next pasture. When we do that, they are ready to move, so they move pretty readily and they kind of know the routine now. First 2 or 3 years, they kind of had to learn what they were doing because they weren't used to moving so often or moving where we wanted them to move, and now they're familiar with all the gates that were installed, so the older cows kind of know, and they'll teach the younger cows how to move from one pasture to another. We like moving the cattle on horseback, especially in the wooded pasture, because we can move around a lot easier with the horses. And there's some places where a four-wheeler just can't get through, so if we're trying to bring a cow-calf pair out of the woods, it's often a lot easier with the horse and rider instead of with a four-wheeler.
Today we moved our cattle. They were ready to move from the pasture they were in. We could actually visibly see that when we got to their watering area. And the cattle knew it was time to move, so cattle kind of learn the rotation, or they learn that they're going to move, and so they'll kind of gather themselves up quite often without a lot of work, which wouldn't have been the case years ago when we weren't on a rotational basis. These cattle would have been spread all over these woods, and we would have been riding a lot of woods and so forth. But now they gather up and they go out. They know where the gates are, and they kind of know when it's time to move, and they know they're going to go to new grass. Working cattle for our particular horses is their job. These horses are registered quarter horses, and they're bred to work cattle. They're bred to actually have the instinct for it and like it. They want to do that job, and particularly the bloodlines that we carry. These horses like the work of it. So it's actually the rotation, having to rotate these cattle is kind of a good little exercise for the horses as well. Because our horses are bred to work cattle, and something in the sale of our horses, we promote as working horses that will do a job on a ranch. I like to, first it gets me out on our ground and in our landscape. Second, it's really good for my horse. It makes her have something to do and think about, and I enjoy being around the cattle a lot as well. And it's also a good training tool for the horses as well, to take them out and introduce them to cattle and get them to learn how they can move cattle and so forth.
Whenever we move pastures, we take a head count on the calves to make sure that none of the calves got left behind. That sometimes the younger ones will hide in the bush, and it's a little hard to find them. So we're just taking a head count and then go back and close the gates and move their water tank. Working with NRCS was beneficial to our operation. We didn't really have any problems with them. Everything went smoothly. We work with Candy and a couple other people in the calf crowing office, and they've been really helpful. And when we make our reports, it just seems to go real quickly, and it's very well organized. I think our first project with the equip was in 2005 when we started dividing up the pastures for rotational grazing, and then we did additional divisions of the pastures about 3 to 4 years later, so 2008, 2009. Also, Jeff Duchesne helped with some of the grazing suggestions, kind of telling us what to look for. And so when we were first getting into the rotational grazing, we just used some of his ideas, and he was very helpful for that. We also put in a watering system with the help of the equip program. So we have a water line that runs right along the fence line, just a summer water line, and that comes down to these 4 pastures here. And then also goes up to another corner where we have 4 pastures that come together, and so we can move a small tank around to those pastures on that water line.
How's the watering system been working out?
I think it works out really well. You can see the tanks, and then we'll move that tank to where they're going to go again. Then we have another, the other quadrants down there, and we have that other pipeline. And then we added another joint up here, so we could extend out. The watering system's been, that's been really, really good. But if we were to do this further out, we would have to change, or add, I should say.
Yeah.
The water system works out very well. It's strictly a warm season water system because a lot of the pipeline is above ground. It's fairly easy to maintain. The initial cost was not that great because we weren't putting it all underground. We use plastic tanks so that anybody can go out and move the tanks around to a different pasture, so we don't have to have a tank in each pasture. We have a water line with a flexible end on it so we can move the tank across a fence line or under a fence line. The tanks take little abuse from the cattle, so we have to replace them every few years, but other than that, it's fairly low maintenance for the water system. And we actually ran it off an existing well that was already supplying a couple barns here, so we just had to tap into that water line. On the east side of the farm, we have rotational grazing for the horses as well, and have a summer watering system for them. This is high-tensile fence that we put in quite a few years ago. I think this was put in 2005, and this was done with the equip program. Before this, it was all this was all one large open pasture, so we divided it up, and then with another project we divided it again, and that's been pretty low maintenance. It's a real good fence if you have a lot of deer and other wildlife, because deer can jump over it and not get tangled up in it like they do with the barbed wire, but it also will snap back a lot better than the barbed wire. The only maintenance we've really seen with it is in the wooded pastures. If you have a storm and you have trees go on your fence, then you have a little more maintenance in a wooded pasture. With the wildlife management for the pastures, in a lot of the fence lines we put on wildlife-friendly fencing, which is a fairly low-cost plastic white markers for the deer to see and other wildlife to see.
So what are some of the benefits of having the ability to put your cattle in the woods?
Well, the cattle, especially this time of year, they like the shade, and getting out of the sun and the bugs, that's a benefit, and it's also a benefit for the wildlife. We like to have a diversity of wildlife in the pastures, and there's the forage is a little more diverse, and it's also good for the soil. It holds more moisture in the soil.
Yeah, spreads the nutrients around. To what extent or time period do you leave the cattle in the forested areas?
Well, typically they're in there for about a week at a time. It depends on which pasture they're in. Some has more open areas with more grass.
Yeah.
So we kind of monitor the forage and maybe leave them in there for a week to 10 days. Okay. And on some of the smaller pastures, they might be just 4 days or so. And it depends on the time of the year too. If it's later in the summer or fall, we might have to move them a little more often. We try to keep the brush down in there so that the grasses can compete a little more. We also have the fence set up so that they can have access to water. An interesting thing with the Silvopasture that we found out from the project with the University of Minnesota Extension Service is that the cows and calves did gain more on the Silvopasture than they did in the open pasture.
So what do you see as a benefit to your trees having the cattle in there?
Well, the first benefit is we thinned out the trees. We're kind of managing it for timber production, and the cattle also fertilize as they go through the woods, so that's a benefit to the trees and the grasses. Once the trees get to a certain stage, the cattle don't really bother them. We haven't seen any detrimental effects from the cattle. They might eat some of the shoots that are from the stump sprouting, but once we get some trees established after we did the logging, then I think that it's good for the trees and the cattle.
Yeah.
With the CSP program, we're improving our hay field. We're using some cover crops in grazing areas. We also manage for wildlife. We've put in a pollinator planting that's in an unused part of the horse pasture that looked like it would be a beneficial area for pollinators. We also do some other management for wildlife. When we do our logging, we leave some areas for wildlife as far as leaving some dead trees for habitat and some brush piles for wildlife habitat.
I love looking at what's happening to our ground and assessing the grasses. We saw 2 sandhill cranes take off. We see a variety of wildlife. We've seen pine marten and occasionally fox. So not only is it working the cattle, but you also have a lot of encounters with what else lives on this ranch. I would say there are fewer ranches that are horse and cattle ranches or have horses, but north of us there are a number of ranches that still use horses quite a bit on their operations. But I think if you're in the southern part of the state, it'd probably be less common.
We really enjoy our ranch and the setting here. It's a kind of a unique place in this county, and we've actually put most of it into a conservation easement so it can't be developed. So we like the idea that after we're gone, it's still going to be relatively the same. Even if it doesn't remain a ranch, it's not going to be developed. We like the lifestyle of living on a ranch and working together. It's usually a little more fun to go out on horseback with somebody else, and so we kind of make it a group effort, and it's work, but it's also enjoyable to be on a horse and out checking pastures, checking fence, and checking on the cows and calves. It's just kind of a lifestyle that we enjoy, working with the horses, and we try to bring young people in to teach them and get them familiar with our ranching operation and how we do things. Not that we do everything the right way, but it exposes the younger helpers to the way we do things, and sometimes they have ideas that we can use too.